Imagine a human being squeezed through a 5-inch hole. You can't, right? But that's exactly what happened on November 5th, 1983, during a catastrophic decompression aboard the Byford Dolphin oil rig. A sudden pressure drop turned a routine dive into sheer horror as immense force pushed one diver's body through a tiny gap, tearing him apart in seconds. 5 men lost their lives in one of the most gruesome accidents in deep-sea history. In this video, we'll dive into what happened on this fateful day. Viewer discretion is advised. Imagine being hundreds of feet below the ocean's surface. It's cold, dark, and the pressure around you could crush anything not built to withstand it. Yet, this is where saturation divers work every day. They're not tourists, and they're not there for fun. They're there to keep the modern world running. Pipelines, oil rigs, underwater cables, none of these things would last without people working in some of the most dangerous conditions on Earth. Saturation divers are a different breed. They do something most of us can't even imagine. Regular divers might go 30, maybe 100 feet down for a little while. But saturation divers, they're working at depths of 500 to even 1,000 feet. At that depth, the rules change. It's not just about staying down there for a few hours and coming back up. No, these divers live under pressure, literally. Let's break it down. When a diver goes deep, the water pressure increases. For every 33 feet, the pressure goes up by 1 atmosphere. So, if you're 300 feet down, that's about 10 atmospheres pressing on your body. The deeper you go, the more pressure there is, and your body starts absorbing gases like nitrogen. If you surface too quickly, those gases turn into bubbles in your bloodstream, leading to a condition called the bends. It's painful, and it can be deadly. So, how do saturation divers avoid that? They stay pressurized. That's the whole idea behind saturation diving. The divers live in special pressurized chambers, sometimes for weeks. These chambers mimic the pressure they're working under. The term saturation comes from the fact that after a certain amount of time, the divers' bodies become fully saturated with nitrogen. Once they're saturated, they won't absorb any more gas, no matter how long they stay underwater. This means they can spend days, even weeks, working at depth without needing to decompress after each shift. But here's the catch. At the end of their time in the chamber, they still need to decompress. It's a long, slow process. For every 100 feet of depth, they spend about a day decompressing. So, if they're working at 600 feet, they might spend 6 days decompressing, slowly adjusting their bodies to normal atmospheric pressure. If they don't, the results could be fatal. Now, picture this. The divers live in a cramped chamber for up to 28 days. They eat, sleep, and hang out in a space barely bigger than a room. Their only job is to work underwater for 8-hour shifts, going down in a pressurized diving bell to the seafloor, doing repairs, inspections, or construction work on things like oil rigs or pipelines. After each shift, they ride back up in the diving bell to their pressurized chamber. There's no popping up for a breath of fresh air. They're stuck in that pressurized environment the entire time. The diving bell is like an elevator that goes from the ocean's surface to the bottom. It's pressurized too, so when the divers are working, they're always in the same pressure environment. When their shift ends, they return to the surface, but they don't leave the bell into normal air. Instead, they transfer under pressure from the bell into their living chamber, a process known as TUP, or transfer under pressure. Let's talk about what these guys are breathing. At those depths, they're not breathing normal air. Air is mostly nitrogen and oxygen, and under high pressure, nitrogen can be a real problem. So, instead, saturation divers breathe a mix of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium. Helium is inert and doesn't cause problems like nitrogen can. But it has a funny side effect. It makes their voices sound high-pitched, like they've been sucking on helium balloons. It might sound funny, but it's just part of the job. The dangers are everywhere. Not only are they working in total darkness with limited visibility, but they're also dragging heavy equipment behind them. They're welding, cutting, and repairing in some of the toughest conditions imaginable. If something goes wrong, if the pressure changes too fast, the results can be horrifying. And that's exactly what happened on the Byford Dolphin. On November 5th, 1983, a routine dive operation aboard the Byford Dolphin, a semi-submersible oil rig in the North Sea, went catastrophically wrong. It involved saturation diving. These professionals are critical to the oil and gas industry. But on this particular day, a tragic mistake turned their dangerous work into a horrific disaster. There were 4 divers involved. 2 British divers, Edwin Arthur Coward and Roy P. Lucas, and 2 Norwegian divers, Bjorn Bergersen and Truls Hellevik. The depth of their dive meant that they were pressurized to 9 atmospheres, which is roughly the pressure you'd experience at 300 feet below sea level. They worked in shifts, one pair diving while the other rested in their chambers, which were designed to keep them at the same pressure they were under while working deep underwater. That morning, Coward and Lucas were off duty, resting in a sleeping chamber. Bergersen and Hellevik had just completed their shift and were being transferred back from the diving bell, which had brought them up from the depths. They were supposed to enter the decompression chamber, the system that allows the divers to move between the diving bell and their pressurized living quarters. Everything seemed routine. This was a procedure they had performed countless times before. But in saturation diving, small mistakes have enormous consequences. The diving bell had docked to the decompression chamber with the help of 2 dive tenders, William Crammond and Martin Saunders. They were working to secure everything as usual. The bell connects to the chamber through a tunnel called a trunk, which is pressurized once the 2 are docked, so the divers can safely transfer without changing pressure. This is what we mentioned before, transfer under pressure. Here's where things went horribly wrong. Bergersen had already entered the chamber and was standing on the far side, while Hellevik was still in the process of closing the hatch between the diving bell and the trunk. Normally, the process would have gone like this. First, the bell door gets closed and sealed by slightly increasing its internal pressure. Then, the door between the trunk and the chamber is closed, followed by slowly depressurizing the trunk to 1 atmosphere. Only after all this can the clamp be safely released to detach the bell. But that's not what happened. Just as Hellevik was about to close the chamber door, Crammond, one of the dive tenders, released the clamp too soon. Whether it was fatigue, miscommunication, or simple error, this single action triggered a deadly chain of events. The clamp should never have been opened before the hatch was fully closed, because that hatch was the only thing keeping the enormous pressure inside the chamber stable. When the clamp was released, there was nothing holding the pressure inside. In an instant, the chamber went from 9 atmospheres down to 1, normal surface pressure. This was an explosive decompression. To understand how powerful this was, imagine what 9 atmospheres of pressure can do. The diving bell, which weighs around 80,000 pounds, was blasted away from the chamber as if it were a rag doll. It flew across the platform, slamming into the 2 dive tenders with the force of a speeding truck. William Crammond, one of the tenders, was killed instantly. Saunders survived, but just barely. He suffered a broken back, a broken neck, and multiple other injuries. He was the only one to live through this accident. But the real horror was inside the chamber. The 4 divers, Coward, Lucas, Bergersen, and Hellevik, were exposed to the violent decompression. The human body is not designed to handle this kind of pressure change. Under normal circumstances, divers decompress slowly to allow the gases dissolved in their blood to safely escape. In this case, the pressure dropped so fast that it was like shaking a soda bottle and ripping the cap off. The nitrogen and other gases in the divers' blood suddenly expanded, boiling inside their veins. For Coward and Lucas, who were resting in their bunks, it was over in an instant. Their bodies couldn't handle the sudden change, and they died where they lay. From the outside, it might have looked like they just stopped breathing. But inside, their blood boiled, their tissues expanded, and their organs were damaged beyond recognition in less than a second. The gases expanded so fast that their bodies swelled, but it was all so sudden that they wouldn't have felt anything. Their brains boiled too, meaning they likely had no awareness of what was happening. Bjorn Bergersen, who was standing when the decompression occurred, was also killed instantly. The gases inside his body expanded, and his circulation stopped in a fraction of a second. He simply collapsed, dead before he hit the floor. The autopsy reports later described the horrific details. The rapid decompression caused the fat in their blood to solidify. Imagine butter sizzling in a hot pan. That's how it was described. The gases mixed with this fat, creating deadly bubbles throughout their bodies, effectively ending all function in a blink. But the most gruesome fate belonged to Truls Hellevik, who was standing near the still partially open hatch when the clamp was released. The gap in the hatch was only about 5 inches wide, just enough space for something unthinkable to happen. The force of the decompression was so strong that Hellevick was sucked toward the gap. The pressure difference acted like a cannon, shooting him toward the opening. His abdomen was the first part of his body to hit the gap, and the pressure behind him was so powerful that it forced his internal organs out through the hole. His body was effectively turned inside out. In the split second that followed, the rest of his body was pushed against the small gap, folding him backward and tearing him apart. Pieces of his body were found scattered across the deck, with some parts found as high as 10 feet above the decompression chamber. It took 4 body bags to collect all of his remains, and investigators still weren't sure they got everything. The carnage was so extreme that it has left a lasting impact on everyone who has heard about the accident. No pictures from the scene have been made public, probably for good reason. The autopsy reports themselves are stomach-churning. One investigator described it as beyond gruesome. Hellevick's face had been peeled clean off in the decompression, and large parts of his skin were left scattered across the platform. It was one of the most violent and grotesque deaths ever recorded. As the dust settled and the investigations began, questions were raised about how this could have happened. The dive tender who opened the clamp, William Cramond, was initially blamed for the accident, though many believe he was unfairly singled out. But was it really all his fault? After the accident, the families, the companies, and the Norwegian government all wanted answers. It was easy to point the finger at Cramond. He was right there. He made the fatal move, and that sealed the fate of the divers inside the chamber. The company behind the Byford Dolphin, Comex, was quick to let the blame settle on him. They wanted to wash their hands of the whole thing. But the truth, as usual, is more complicated. First, Comex could have installed safety mechanisms that would have prevented this. In fact, these safety features, a simple interlocking mechanism, were already required by law. The technology wasn't new or revolutionary. It was standard, and regulations had been passed in 1982, a year before the accident, mandating that saturation dive rigs must have these systems. The mechanism would have prevented the clamp from being released until the hatch was fully closed, making an incident like this impossible. So, why didn't the Byford Dolphin have it? Because it was an older rig, built before the regulations took effect, and it was grandfathered in. Comex wasn't legally obligated to upgrade the equipment, so they didn't. They could have chosen safety over cost, but they didn't. That wasn't the only thing they cut corners on. Comex had been pushing divers to work longer and longer shifts. The standard was around 8 hours, but the company successfully lobbied the Norwegian government to extend those shifts. Divers were now working 14 to 18 hours at a stretch. Imagine being hundreds of feet underwater, working in complete darkness, pulling massive cables or welding in near-freezing temperatures, all while completely exhausted. It's no wonder mistakes happened. Cramond wasn't just a scapegoat. He was a victim of the company's relentless drive for profit at the expense of safety. The families of the 6 men involved were the ones who truly suffered. The Norwegian government paid some compensation to the families of the Norwegian divers, Bergersen and Hellevick. Saunders, the lone survivor, received disability benefits through the UK. But the families of the British divers, Coward, Lucas, and Cramond, were left out in the cold. They were denied compensation from both the company and the Norwegian government. For 25 years, the widows of these men raised their children with little support, their husbands' deaths haunting them. It wasn't until 2009 that the North Sea Divers Alliance brought a lawsuit over the accident. Finally, after decades of fighting, the families received a settlement, though the amount was never disclosed. It wasn't enough to bring back what they lost, but it was at least some recognition that the company bore responsibility for the tragedy. Ruth Cramond, Billy's widow, had to move away from her home in Edinburgh because of the hate directed at her family after the accident. But after the lawsuit was settled, she was able to return, vindicated in some small way. The Byford Dolphin disaster was a turning point. Regulations in the diving industry became much stricter. Today, the North Sea is considered one of the safest places for divers. But even now, commercial diving remains incredibly dangerous. Every year, deaths are still reported, including one chilling incident in 2022 when 5 underwater welders were sucked into an oil pipe off the coast of Trinidad. Only one survived. Despite the risks, saturation divers keep taking on these jobs. Why? It's simple. The pay is astronomical. These divers are some of the highest paid workers in the world. But it's not just about the money. It's about the challenge, the adventure, the sense of purpose that comes with doing a job few others can handle. It takes a special kind of person to take on a job where one mistake can mean instant death. And even though robots are starting to take on more tasks, saturation divers still have a vital role. For now, they're irreplaceable. The industry learned from this tragedy, making it safer for those who followed. But the memory of that day and the lives lost still lingers in the deep.